My name is Kaveri Haritas. I frequently write academically under a pen name. I've taken up my late grandmother's name, Tara, so I sometimes write under that name. I won't really give you an introduction to myself. I think you can find that out online. You have the faculty pages to get to know the different faculty and the kind of work that we do. I also have a blog of my own, which is quite thorough. It has all the work that I've done till now and a brief note about me. It's called Inclusions and Exclusions. It's a WordPress blog, so do look up. If you type in Kaveri Haritas Inclusions and Exclusions on a Google page, you'll find my blog. So today we are going to discuss the use of social sciences and the utility of studying actually social sciences in any crisis situation, I would say. And since we are undergoing the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, we will talk specifically about why it is important to have a very thorough knowledge of the social sciences and how this knowledge can actually be used in order to reduce the impact of the pandemic. You can't prevent a pandemic. It frequently occurs, as you guys must have heard of. There was the H1N1, which was also a pandemic. There were other pandemics prior to this, the influenza pandemic. There were many other such diseases which broke out in the past, which wiped out millions of people. And we are sadly, having to undergo the pandemic now. But what can the social sciences add in terms of value to understanding the impacts of the pandemic on various groups of people, and therefore being able to minimize the impacts on various groups of people? We are living in a social world that is already rather complex and which is already, quite exclusionary in various ways. There are several marginalized groups, caste, religion, racial groups, gender-based groups that are already unequal. So we are in an unequal world already. And then when we have a pandemic like this, it is bound to affect different groups of people in different ways. It is bound to affect those people who are already less equal than we are. And we are a privileged group of people, the middle classes in India, as well as the upper middle classes, the elite part of the Indian society. We are far few in number, right? The larger number or the larger group of people are essentially poorer people. And these are the groups of people that you will see various impacts on. So, in a certain sense, the pandemic is not in any sense creating inequalities per se. It is actually strengthening or reinforcing the inequalities that are already there in our society. So, groups that are already marginalized, that are already excluded, that are already far more vulnerable to social impacts of various sorts, be it a financial crisis or the other kinds of crises. For example, we saw demonetization, GST, all of these other actions. There are certain groups that are far more vulnerable because they are less equal than us. We are a privileged society. We can afford to be here on this talk. We can, we have access to a laptop, we have access to internet, we are able to take part in intellectual engagements of certain sort. A lot of the groups are not as equal as we are, and so therefore the pandemic reinforces or rather strengthens these given inequalities and makes the situation worse off for certain groups of people. So the social sciences actually studies various groups of people. We study these different kinds of inequalities, and therefore it is extremely important to integrate a social science perspective in managing the pandemic, something that we see is completely, largely absent in the manner in which the government has responded in the past. And I will give you a few instances of how the government really did not integrate a social science approach to managing this pandemic, and therefore what are the results, and therefore what are the consequences of this on various groups of people, and therefore also on the wealth of our country. Remember that when the people or the population in a country are doing well, when they are earning well, when they are living well, one great example is China, for instance, which is increasingly improving in terms of economic parameters. They have largely reduced their poverty. Uh, People are beginning to therefore climb above poverty, but also consume. They are consuming a lot more. Therefore, economically, in terms of the gross domestic, you know, product, these are societies when the people that are there within them are better off and they are wealthier, then the society as such does much better economically as well as socially. So it is therefore extremely important to first understand what these existing inequalities are, and based on these existing inequalities, manage the various actions that the state takes in response to the pandemic, right? So my first slide is just a very large sort of a table of contents on what we are going to discuss today. The first issue is work, migration, and unemployment. Immediately after that, I'm sorry, I put it at E. Immediately after that, we're going to talk about gender and work. We are also going to discuss fallen income, rise in debt, lower purchasing power of groups, poverty, increasing poverty. We're going to discuss very briefly education disparities, as well as inequalities in access to healthcare, right? I must say at the very beginning that this is not going to be an exhaustive talk. It's a little bit of an introductory talk, and it will also give you an idea of what to expect in terms of the different courses that you will be taking up in JSGP, the BA SSP program, which is a lot of thought went into this program. We discussed this over 2 years on what exactly we wanted our students to study in order to become better, first better citizens and better individuals, more well-read, more well-aware citizens and individuals, but also policy professionals of various sorts, researchers, whatever field of activity that they are going to take up, to be able to ensure that they have a very strong and solid grounding in social sciences that will enable them to therefore apply their knowledge in various areas. Now, we saw in the very beginning of the pandemic, the first lockdown that was imposed, that there was a large oversight. That is, that the government, I still remember the first, instruction, which was to stay at home, not to go outside home, and then to come out and bang those thalis and stuff like that. And at that point of time, I think the government had really not considered the impact of people who are, one, living in extremely crowded housing, slums, jhuggi jhopadis, bastis of various sorts. When you talk about staying home for this group of people, it's not a given, right? Because their homes are so small. I have worked in some of these slums and slum areas. In fact, I've recently published a book on my doctoral research in a slum area, in slum rehabilitation area in Bangalore. The houses are about 25, square feet houses, very tiny houses. And if people actually cannot really stay inside their homes for a very long time. In fact, people spend a lot of their time outside their homes. They're sitting in the corridors, they're sitting on corners. So stay at home, what does one really mean by stay at home, right? So the first thing that the government did not consider is that there's a very large group of people who are living in extremely poor housing, in which they can all not stay at home. So if there are 5 members in a family, how can they stay within a small 25 square foot home? So the response to the pandemic, in a certain sense, did not take into account all of those urban studies and social studies of these very crowded, very tiny small houses. And the image that you can see on the right side, right bottom side, is actually an image of Dharavi. They never really thought about how people would actually stay within their homes in Dharavi, right? In Dharavi, people don't really stay within their homes. their home actually extends out onto the street. So the neighborhood, the street in front of them, in fact, the next street above them, they're all part of their home because they live in such tiny, crowded places. So not planning for these groups resulted in those very initial first spikes of the coronavirus in places like Dharavi until the Mumbai Municipal Corporation kicked in and launched a sort of an action plan and began to intensify their efforts in these areas. The second most important, which we all witnessed on television, is these hundreds and thousands of people who are walking back to their homes, right? I mean, Modi ji said stay at home, so they decided, okay, now it's time for us to go home, and they realized there was no transportation, so people walked thousands and thousands of miles. And the picture you see here is actually a very neat image. Here people are well clothed, they have footwear, but this was not the case of the many thousands of people who walked home without slippers, carrying little babies in their arms, without access to any sort of food or shelter during their way. Many thousands of people who had, hundreds of people who died on the way back home. So for these people, stay at home really, but home is back in the villages. These are the migrants. These are the internal migrants. These are people who migrate to cities for work and who don't really have a home in the city. So, in a certain sense, the first two problems that we witnessed was because the government did not really take account of the massive literature and the massive amount of work that is being done on internal migration within India. A lot of social scientists have studied this for decades, and the government did not take that into acknowledgement. Even providing people a certain amount of time, say maybe 3 to 4 days, to travel back to their villages may have largely, largely reduce the negative consequences that it had on the many migrant people who lost their lives trying to go back home to their villages, right? The second slide is on unemployment, and here once again, I'm going to sort of also underline a little bit the different courses you're going to take. Migration, for instance, we talked about internal migration. So we do look at labor and work in JSGP. I'll just come back to that side. We look at labor and work in JSGP, and so you will have a good number of courses that will allow you to better understand the world of work and employment. And you will also then be able to, you'll be introduced to different kinds of data and statistics on work and employment in India. You will know the difference between formal and informal employment. When you look at a certain set of data, you will know what kind of employment this is talking about. You will also have courses on poverty, for instance, urban poverty, housing. These are all courses, these are all elective courses that would be provided to you at various points of time in addition to the core courses in your syllabus. So talking about work, the pandemic and the shutdown, the initial lockdown, but then the impact of the lockdown, which lasted a longer period of time, also had extremely negative impacts on various groups of people. For instance, here I have more recent data on the second wave, which rendered 1 crore Indians jobless, right? So 97% of household incomes declined during the pandemic. It said over 10 million Indians have lost their jobs because of the second wave of COVID-19, and 97% of household incomes have declined. And this is CMIE data, the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy data. And Mahesh Vyas, who heads this organization, explained that people who lose their jobs find it extremely difficult to get employment. Because remember, already even prior to the pandemic, India was going through an unemployment crisis. So unemployment levels were rising even prior to the pandemic. And so immediately after the pandemic, it got a lot more worse. Unemployment rate had now touched, as of May 2020, it had touched 23.5% in May 2020 because of the national lockdown. After that, the levels have sort of come back once again, but then the levels of unemployment, which is around 12% in the country right now, is still much higher than what it should normally be, which is between 3 to 4%, right? So the pandemic is going to have an immense impact on jobs. People will lose jobs. One of the sectors in which people have lost jobs, and perhaps the most important sector where people have lost jobs, is transportation, right? Travel. People are no longer traveling, so airlines have shut down. They're working very partially. There are very few trips that they are making. So, but travel also is about vacations. It's also about um, people going to spaces such as, temples and spending money, or people going to beaches and spending money. So all of that has also shut down. So all of these shops, all of these economic enterprises built around travel have sort of plummeted. I'm just giving you one example. There are many, many more examples. Uh, so how should the pandemic have been planned? They should have taken into account, or there should have been a sort of an understanding or a mapping of all the sectors that are going to be very, very deeply affected, and certain measures to sort of tackle these different sectors. And here you do not see, for instance, I talked about travel. The government has not done much to address the crisis in the travel tourism sector, even more broadly, the tourism sector, right? How do households manage until COVID-19 is over, until people begin to travel again, people begin to take their vacations again? So there has been really no coherent attempt to address these loss in jobs. On the other hand, people's incomes are also falling because the institutions, corporations, all kinds of production enterprises are suffering, and because there is a cut in the profits that have been earned by various companies, that hit is being taken by employees. So you see that there are lowering incomes. So household debt therefore has increased. Debt meaning household borrowings, right? That is, people who are borrowing more in order to substitute the income that they are now that they have now lost, right? So here it says in 4 years since 2018, household debt has jumped from 30% in 2018, which was the year of the GST implementation, and there already they had seen a hike in household debt immediately after that, to 31.7% in 2019, 32.5% in 20, and to a massive 37.3% in 2021, right? So this is based on an SBI research report. Now, there's also this paragraph which says household debt includes retail loans, crop loans, business loans from financial institutions like banks, credit societies, non-banks, and housing finance companies. So household debt also includes all of those, home loans that you have taken. It includes retail loans. For example, a shopkeeper who has purchased and needs a loan in order to make purchases to, stock up grocery, for example, will take out a retail loan. A farmer who takes up a crop loan. So household debt actually includes all of those other debts which are taken in order to run a business or to run a work enterprise, right? This is a little bit unsettling, and this is something perhaps that the government could have better planned if it had a lot more, social scientists, economists advising it. Not to say that the government doesn't have economists, but this part of, managing household debt in order to have that kind of expertise on how to enable households. There was a lot of talk when the budget came out on how the government should have come out with measures to improve spending, that is consumer spending, because consumer spending had gone down. Why had it gone down? Because people were not buying because they were afraid. One, their incomes were going down. Two, they were afraid of losing incomes or losing their jobs. So obviously savings they were trying to save as much as possible in order to spend it on the most basic essentials. So there's been a lot of talk about that in the budget, but very little done to enable people to reduce their household debt, right? Which is why you see it rising like this. Now, what happens when debt increases? Your income is either reduced or you lose your job, your debt goes up. You obviously see a massive number of families sliding or slipping into poverty. A Pew Research Center has shown an estimated 75 million people slipped into poverty since the pandemic began. The second wave is set to crush some more. For the study, Pew considered daily incomes of 150 rupees or less as poor. That is 150 rupees a day, right? 151 to 750 rupees as low income and 3,750 rupees and above as high income, right? So COVID-19, in a certain sense, the pandemic has largely impacted the economic sector, and it has done this not just in India, but across the world, and various countries have been dealing with it differently, right? Each country deals with it differently. And here, because we are a poorer country, meaning we have a lot more people in poverty as compared to some of the Western parts of the world where they have much lesser rates of poverty. Therefore, the manner in which we should have responded to the pandemic, and we should have provided some sort of or some sort of a safety net to groups which are more vulnerable. I think there very little has been done, and of course the government has been saying that it has done very little because it doesn't have the means to do it, doesn't have the money to do it, and there is a lot of debate on whether this is really true in fact, and whether the government could have done a lot more with the available resources. I don't know how many of you follow the news, but so much of this GST earnings, for example, have not yet been distributed to the states. So there's a lot of income that the central government has sort of kept with itself and has refused to release. And perhaps that income could have been used even by the various states to better bolster the economy. Now, this is a matter of debate, but these are issues, for instance, that you would be discussing in many of the economics oriented course. I must say I enjoy reading a lot of this, but I'm not an economist. So some of these very detailed questions on fiscal planning, for example, should be posed to my colleagues who will be able to provide you a better response. Now the gendered impact of work, right? When people lose jobs, the first thing that you normally notice is that a lot more women lose jobs than men, and this is true, I would say, of any part of the world, not just in India, right? Why is that? Because in various parts of the world, I must say, as well as in the Western parts of the world, there is a gap in income. The male income is much generally marginally or much higher in India. It's much higher than the female income, and therefore families sort of make an assessment: should we keep the man at work, should we keep the woman at work? Maybe it's better for the woman to retract from the workplace, because then the male income can continue and the woman can support the man in better doing his job and keeping his employment. So you see all of these sort of calculations and strategies that families make in order to survive during difficult times, right? So you see that gender is largely, I mean, women's work is largely impacted when there is unemployment. So there is a larger or a higher female and unemployment as compared to male employment. Now in India, we have already had a much larger female um, participation ratio, meaning participation in work, labor force participation ratio, and this has become even more heightened during the pandemic. So I've got two snippets for you, and then when we are talking about women, it's rural women who are taking a higher hit. So you see that even between urban and rural women, it's the more marginalized women who are being impacted. India has one of the lowest female labor force participation rate. As you can see, it's a pre-COVID it was about 25%, and now it's about 18% in urban areas. And it's rural women who borne the burden of lockdowns. In the first month of the national lockdown. I'm sorry, I can't see this. I don't know why, but just try to I don't know why this is coming. Just give me a moment. Okay. So it's about 15.4 million women who lost their jobs, of which 12 million women, 12 million were rural. So 12 out of the 15.4 million women who lost employment were rural women. Now, despite this, the rates of rural women's employment rebounded to pre-COVID levels by July 2020. Now, over the past 1 year, urban women were pushed into rural work. Between March 2020 and 2021, number of women employed in rural areas increased by 9.6%, while those employed in urban areas fell by 19.6%. This shift was lower amongst men, with male rural employment rising only by 0.8% and urban employment falling by 0.3%. As a second wave hit rural India with an unexpected ferocity, it washed away 5.7 million rural women's jobs in April 2021. So rural women formed nearly 80% of the job losses in April 2021 compared to just 11% in April the year before, the previous lockdown, in April 2020. Some early signs of recovery were seen in May 2021 as nearly as 2.8 million rural women returned to employment. 11% of rural female workforce, comprising 11% of the rural female workforce, even though 8.6 million rural men lost jobs, 3.5% of rural male workforce. So just a little bit of a background to this. Even in the rural sector, you see that increasingly male agricultural employment, that is, agricultural employment is primarily, there are a lot more women as compared to men who are engaged in agriculture in the rural areas, right? So there's already what you call a feminization of agriculture that is taking place in rural India. And then you see these shifts of employment, right, between rural and urban women. So the urban women are now seeking rural jobs because obviously urban jobs are not available. And you see a much higher fall in women's employment in both the places as compared to male employment. So certain groups of people, as we said earlier, it's the poorer groups of people, but here you see women. So gender is also one of the courses that we teach in JSDP to better sort of acquaint you with the problems, the specific problems that women face in various on various issues. You see that on the other hand, you also have something called work from home, and I put in a small narrative for you here. I'll just read it out very quickly. Srishti Kothari enjoyed her work as a corporate lawyer, but the 32-year-old Noida resident says that her firm's lack of sensitivity towards her family responsibilities during the pandemic forced her to put in her papers. After months of work from home, she was asked to resume work from her office. And when I requested that I be allowed to continue working from home, as I have an infant as well as elders at home whose safety I was concerned about, that is her bosses, suggested I resign. So this is another thing you're beginning to see. You also have a lot of literature on how women who are working from home see a dip in their productivity levels, meaning that because a woman is at home and she is far more available to her family, and perhaps in many of these families, there could also be a fall in income. So it's quite possible that the domestic maid who was employed is no longer employed. So maybe there is also an increase in women's work at home, that is domestic work at home. It's quite possible that even if there is none of this happening, that there are people who are ailing at home, who are sick, and therefore domestic maid is not employed. So you see paid, that is employed women beginning to do also a lot more of unpaid work at home, right? That is the domestic work that used to be done and used to be paid for earlier, is now being done by somebody who is no longer able to hire that person for various reasons. And therefore, the employed woman is providing for both paid as well as unpaid work. This is the other thing that gender, it's not that the COVID pandemic has brought in all of these have already existed before. The pandemic has sort of like I said, strengthening or reinforcing, it is increasing the effect on these groups of people. Because even prior to the pandemic, you see a lot of studies done on the kind of work that women and men do. For instance, women perform 352 minutes of unpaid work every day as compared to 52 minutes of unpaid work done by men in any family in India, for example. These are OECD, this is OECD data, right? So you already have women doing a lot of unpaid work, and now you have a pandemic and the unpaid work increases, right? So you see that a certain part of the population which is already very vulnerable, which is already suffering from exclusion and marginalization of various sorts, is further marginalized and is further excluded. So you see dips in productivity because of this, right? Because women are uh, unable to handle the amount of both paid as well as unpaid work. So their paid work begins to become affected because of the increase in their unpaid work. So gender is definitely one course that you will be, a core course that you will be taking up in your BASSP. Education. So you see, you know, when you had the lockdown, obviously children had to stay home. You guys are examples. You guys also had to stay at home and study from home. I'm sure a lot of you have access to internet, right? This is not the case with a lot of poor people, for instance. The fact that a lot of poor children did not have access to smartphones meant that they could no longer, you know, access online education, right? So families would borrow money to buy a smartphone so that their children could attend classes on a regular basis. Recently on news, we saw this girl, I think it was in Hyderabad or Telangana, I don't remember. She was selling mangoes in order to save up money to purchase a smartphone. And I think there was a technology sector employee who saw this and realized this and then gave her a lot of money so she could purchase her smartphone and therefore attend classes. The other part of this is it's not just attending classes. There's a picture here of children sitting down and eating their meals. The reason that I put that in here is because India has perhaps one of the largest midday meal programs in the world, meaning that a good number of impoverished or poor children get their nutrition by going to school. They go to school, they get a meal, a nutritious meal, and that enables them to reach their growth targets. That is, they don't, they are able to, they are not stunted, right? So they are able to reach the correct heights and they are not underweight, right? So nutritional schools also perform this task, and I think this is something that has completely been overlooked. We keep talking about the digital divide in education, but the other thing I think we are going to see, India is already suffering from an increase in malnutrition rates in children. Between 2014 and 2020 already, we have had data to show that there has been an increase in malnutrition, meaning there are more children who are stunted, more percentage of children who are stunted, more percentage of children who are underweight. So with children not going to school and not having access to their midday meal, this is bound to therefore increase. Unless the government does something and provides these midday meals at the homes of these children rather than the schools, because schools are closed, right? In most parts, in some parts, of course, schools have been opened, and thank God, perhaps there children get to meet their nutritional requirements. I've also put in data here on the impact of COVID. You see, 20% of rural children immediately after the lockdown last year did not have access to textbooks. 5.3% of rural children are not enrolled in school this year in comparison to just 1.8. So that's three times, more than three times the rate at which there used to be enrollment earlier, right? 20% of rural children did not have textbooks at home. 70% of rural children did some learning activity. Of these, only 11% had live online classes. A lot of these children receive WhatsApp messages with their notes and stuff like that, and they have to more or less figure out and learn by themselves. With remember that these are also children from impoverished families, so they don't have mothers or fathers who are educated well enough. In most cases, perhaps there may be some cases where there are parents who are well educated, but in most of these cases even the parents will not be able to help their children in their education. Less than 36% of rural children receive learning materials. 75% of school interaction was via WhatsApp, right? So this is the other concern. And here once again we have courses on education. You will have an elective at some point in time on education and education policy in India. And this will give you a better idea. And this is perhaps also something that the government has not paid sufficient attention on and has not rolled out creative ways of learning. For instance, some steps have been taken by state governments. In Gujarat, for instance, I heard that there are street schools that are being organized, meaning it's outdoor schools where children are masked, they go out, they sit outside and they learn outside, obviously if the climatic conditions are right, but that something is still better than nothing. And perhaps a more creative policy was essential. Lalit gives me a missed call, so I'm almost done with my time. Okay, I'm at the end almost. Thank you, Lalit. The last slide is on health inequalities, and the most obvious, very frequently when we think about health, we think, okay, we need to have good hospitals and we need to have good doctors, and that's enough, right? But that's not enough. As you realize, as we realize, as soon as COVID hit us, the most important worker was the ASHA worker, huh? That was the last community level worker who was able to go to families to find out if people were infected with COVID, identify families where there were infections, track and trace them. So the health sector as such is not just comprised of hospitals and doctors. We also have a large arena of other kinds of workers, ASHA workers and community workers who are also contributing to this, right, in various ways during this COVID pandemic. And we tend to think about health as if it is something that only MBBS students should study. No, there is a social aspect to health as well, because there are so many populations that are far more at risk, far more vulnerable. So there are social studies of health that are extremely important in understanding what these groups are and what are the reasons why they are excluded from health. Here are some really very most obvious, impacts of the health inequalities. We know that our villages are very, very poor in terms of healthcare. So when we had the India second wave, ravaging villages, there were several villages without any hospitals. So you see this Chogat, is a rural, remote village town in which there is a local pharmacist, and this is in Gujarat, who is attending to people instead of a doctor because they do not have a hospital or a trained doctor there, right? This is about 7,400 people. There were 5 to 600 cases of COVID in the village, and the only person who people could actually go to was a local pharmacist. This shows really how already existing inequality were administered to women, that is less than half, compared with nearly 167 million to men, according to CoWIN. A ratio of 856 doses given to women for every 1,000 doses given to men. So this is really a problem, right? I mean, you realize that in managing a pandemic or managing a crisis of any sort, first, what we really need to know is to understand the existing social inequalities that are out there. We have at GSTP a group of health professionals who are also more recently providing a range of very interesting and very, very dynamic courses on health um, in within JSGP for you to be better able to understand the health domain, to understand the health-based inequality. So just to sum up, I've come to the end of my presentation. Just to sum up, the social sciences and the pandemic, I think people sort of underestimated the importance of a very strong social science knowledge in dealing with the pandemic. A lot of things that we were not able to manage very well till now was primarily because we did not pay attention to the importance of social sciences in understanding the impacts on various groups and therefore preventing the fallouts of these of the pandemic on various groups. So with this, I come to an end. So I see only the first two students who had enrolled, Manasa and Nandini. Would you have any questions or comments?
Thank you so much, Professor. So one question that I had is that when we spoke about gender, we talked about the paid work and the unpaid work. And another thing that I was thinking about is that women also kind of do this thing called emotion work within the family, where they sort of bear the burden of keeping the people happy and like absorbing their sort of negative emotion and like their anger or sadness or anxiety. And we see this sometimes in like domestic violence. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how that has affected as well.
That's a very interesting question. May I ask, do you already have a social science background, Manasa?
I studied sociology at the A level. Yeah.
Where did you study it?
A school called Center for Learning here in Bangalore.
I see. That's very good because they've trained you very well. Emotion work. Did you read anything on emotion work?
There's some sociologists named Delphi and Leonard who speak about it, and we looked at quite a bit at their work. Yeah.
Okay. That's actually a relatively new concept. The reason I asked is, this form of work has only been recently recognized. The first person to actually come out with this concept was this anthropologist called Arlie Hochschild, where she talked about emotion work, which is being conducted by various paid professionals. For instance, air hostesses, they have to smile, they have to look like they are in good humor even when they are not. They have to please people, they have to have a certain kind of you know uh, emotional response all the time. They're not allowed to be angry or frustrated. They have to be patient, tolerant, smiling, graceful, right? So this concept actually sort of was initially propounded by her and now has gained a lot of strength in other realms of work as well, such as the one that you have spoken about, that is when you're caregiving within your family. I have a 11-year-old boy, or if you have children, you can't allow yourself to go out of control, so you're constantly managing your emotions so you can better manage your household and families. So yes, I mean, emotion work is a huge part already of domestic work, right? So it's interesting, and I like this question very much because I've just written my book, and a chapter of this book is on a concept that I have sort of tried to float now, and something I'm working on, which is political work, which is that very frequently women also perform a lot of political work. They make political networks, they make contacts, they keep good relations with certain kinds of families that are beneficial to their family. For poorer women, some of these political contacts are very proximate, contacts in terms of their local representative, the ward representative, certain officials within the government. And within this concept of political work, I was also looking at how some of this political work involves a good amount of the use of emotion. So yes, women do employ emotion, and here it's quite interesting because people generally think about women as emotional beings. They think that, oh, these women women are generally emotional, right? This is what Arlie Hochschild sort of discusses in her work. It's somehow sort of seen that as if we are unable, that there is a lack of control over our emotions. But if you actually look at how women employ emotions, women are actually using emotion at various points in time to sort of get the kind of effect that they want to get people to do what they want to, or to get access to certain things. So emotions are, in a certain sense, it's not that women are out of control or they let their emotions out of control, but emotions are actually employed to get what they want, right? So in a certain sense, that becomes emotion work. So that's my take on it. Yes, emotion work is an extremely important part of it. And there can be negative fallouts of emotion work, meaning that if you're just unable to express your emotion, be angry or be upset or be frustrated, and you're constantly expected to perform using a certain array of emotions only, that can therefore affect you, right? Affect you as a person, because you have a lot of bottled up emotions and pent up frustrations. It can have negative effects, but it can also be employed, as I said, by women to get certain things, right? To get family members to do certain things that they want them to do. So, in employing emotion, what I also think is interesting is that women are also sometimes very willingly using gender stereotypes in their emotional work, right? In their emotion work. So thank you very much for bringing up this very interesting topic. And any other questions? What about you, Nandini?
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning,
Ma'am,
Nandini.
I wanted to ask, that, ma'am, with so much of things going on in India, so much people are dying and all, ma'am, why do you think the government decided to like send the aid to other countries when our economic status is one thing, but why do you think that we plan to first help them and like with the existing condition and shortage of vaccination in many areas of India?
So, Nandini, are you referring to the fact that the government allowed so many of these vaccines to go to other countries when we had a shortage? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I think that was a huge misstep, and I think there were problems. And if you read a little bit more on it, from what I understand, there, the government did not place orders for these vaccines within time. So they expected that the vaccine companies would manufacture these vaccines without placing orders for them. And I think that is really the reason why things went really bad. So here, once again, there is a lack of adequate planning prior to the incident, right? I mean, if you had done some amount of planning earlier and realized that once the vaccine is out, there's going to be a huge demand from outside. How do we manage this demand in terms of vaccinating our own populations? And here you can take lessons, for example, from the United States, as well as several other European countries, Germany, for instance, where they had put in restrictions on export of vaccines until their population was vaccinated. So here it is a misstep, and I honestly think that there are several fronts on which the government did not adequately plan, right? And that's also where you see a lot of lack of lack of interest in taking on board social scientists. Social scientists could have come together to minimize the impacts of this, but sadly the government relied on its own bureaucracy, and these officers, IAS officers, are very well trained officers, extremely intelligent people. They pass the IAS exams, in order to make it to their positions. But then once within the bureaucracy, there is a lot that is sort of left to experiential learning, and it's only so far that you can go with experiential learning. You also need a good amount of academic expertise and social science expertise within the government, which we see lacking at the moment. So are there other questions? Any other comments? Would you, do you want to have a last thing to say, Manasa or Nandini? Either one of you? Nandini, where are you from? I'm sorry, I did not ask you.
Ma'am, I am from Sonipat itself.
From Sonipat.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Great. Which part of Sonipat are you?
Pancham Nagar, near Sudanshan.
From?
It's near model town place called Pancham Nagar. I'm from there.
Ah, okay. Okay, great. So you've also studied social sciences in the background in your past, or? Nandini? Sorry, we can't hear you. Okay. Okay. So I think we are more or less done, unless Mansa wants to say something before we sign off.
Nothing else here, ma'am. Thank you.
Nothing else. Okay. Thanks. It was nice to meet both of you. Hope you enjoyed the talk, and looking forward to seeing you both in the BA SSP course the coming semester.
Looking forward to it as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.